We're going to reconvene our afternoon meeting with John Leibowitz of the Northeast Wilderness Trust. Welcome, Mr. Leibowitz.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Sheldon, members of the committee. Thank you for asking me to speak today about old forests and biodiversity. I don't think I know most of you, so I'm going to speak a little bit about me and my work very briefly. I'm a Vermonter by choice, i.e. I moved here. First joining VYCC through AmeriCorps, working at Elmore State Park, and I decided to stay to attend and eventually graduate from Vermont Law School. I've been working in private land conservation for over a decade, and I live in Middlesex, where I serve on the Planning Commission. I'm here before you today as the Executive Director of Northeast Wilderness Trust, a nonprofit conservation organization based here in Montpelier. The Wilderness Trust's mission is to conserve forever wild landscapes for nature and people. We are the Northeast's only land trust that focuses exclusively on rewilding land through forever wild conservation. Forever wild conservation, also sometimes called wilderness, wildlands, natural areas, ecological reserves, is the most protective form of conservation for land, and it's equivalent to what you have heard in previous testimony as GAP 1. If you're using the IUCN standards. On the ground, forever wild forests are provided permanent legal protection to grow old, store immense carbon, harbor rich biodiversity. And we like to say at the Northeast Wilderness Trust that every acre that we protect today is an old growth forest of the future. So it's a wildly hopeful mission. And we currently protect 73,000 acres of forever wild land across the Northeast, and 15,000 of that is right here in Vermont. The lands that we safeguard here in Vermont include the Bramhall Wilderness Preserve, which this is a photo of, the Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve in Woodbury and Elmore, the recently protected Blue Mountain Sanctuary in Rygate. And we also hold forever wild conservation easements on properties such as the Nature Conservancy's Burnt Mountain in Montgomery and on lands owned by individuals in towns like Jericho and Guilford around the state. So conservation easements, as many of you know, are permanent deed restrictions that run with the title of a property. They've been used for decades in Vermont with great success to curtail development rights on agricultural lands, managed timberlands, and town forests. And thus they help keep farms and woodlot owners in business and important open space undeveloped. The forever wild conservation easements that we hold similarly prevent future land conservation and development, but also preclude logging. So that's the big difference, and also preclude generally intensive recreation. Forever wild easements naturally create old forests. They maximize carbon storage and they assist in watershed protection. So last week, this committee heard excellent testimony from Jamie Irvin on 30 by 30, Eric Sorensen on biodiversity of Vermont, Charlie Hancock and Jamie Fidel on fragmentation and sound forest management. And all of those testimonies were comprehensive. And on the specifics, I have little to add. So what I'd rather like to do today is complement those testimonies by presenting to this committee a different lens through which to view these critical matters before you. So I'm going to discuss old forests, future old forests, and conserving nature generously through the lens of ecocentrism, which is an academic and admittedly wonky term for a perspective that was beautifully and simply articulated by a conservationist named Aldo Leopold 75 years ago. And Aldo Leopold said, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. And when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Aldo Leopold was articulating a perspective that species and ecosystems have value and interests that ought to be respected regardless of whether they serve human needs. We are, after all part of the same community and the same biosphere, all birthed from what Leopold poetically called the evolutionary odyssey. For those that are not familiar with his history, it's worth thinking about. He was a holistic thinker. He was an avid hunter, a forester by training and occupation. He was an early successful advocate for designating wilderness areas on America's national forests. He also wrote the textbook on game management. He thought deeply about how lands we use to produce timber, crops, and livestock can be maintained to support long-term health of the entire life community, including people, and how unwise land use leads to loss of soil fertility, erosion, poor water quality, and degradation of wildlife habitat, all results that undermine the long-term health of the whole land community. Working over the years with friends and neighbors who managed their family farms and forests in Wisconsin, Aldo Leopold realized that larger economic forces as well as local norms greatly influence how people use land and thus shape the ecological health over time. Most pertinent to our topic today, Aldo Leopold came to understand and to articulate the immense value of wilderness as, his quote, land laboratories to be studied as the reference for how healthy land maintains itself as an organism, producing integrity, and why such wildlands are crucial to help us improve stewardship of the managed landscape we use to produce livestock, lumber, maple syrup, etc. This map, obviously not of Vermont, is of the Hilo Wilderness and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness. And it's relevant because on June 3rd, 1924, nearly exactly a century ago, at Aldo Leopold's insistence, this wilderness became the first designated wilderness on the planet. So in short, holding an ecocentric perspective that focuses on health of the land community does not mean that we shouldn't manage some of the landscape for the incredibly valuable resources that it provides to us. Rather, it asks us to consider more than just those resources, and of course, to set aside places where there is no resource extraction at all. Last year, the Wilderness Trust celebrated its 20th anniversary with the slogan that you can see here, "We are one of many." The Wilderness Trust approaches conservation through this ecocentric or community lens. We approach conservation from the baseline of human beings being part of the whole, not separate from nature, and certainly not above it. When this legislative body tackles topics such as 30 by 30 or any policy affecting land use in Vermont, viewing these matters through the lens of community asks you to consider the health of the whole. Despite the common language that we use to commodify the natural world and tell ourselves that it was all put here for us, what you are considering and legislating on is not just a policy decision affecting natural resources or open space or sustainable development or places that simply provide ecosystem services. What you are talking about and legislating on are homes. Our home, of course, but also the forests, wetlands, and waters in which we share this landscape with are home to many species who live here. The other species who call Vermont's natural lands home are our literal genetic cousins, and they are individuals worthy of ethical consideration. They are all just trying to get by in life, find food and shelter, and raise their young, not all too different from any of us. So who else lives here? When preparing for this testimony, I had the data for the state of Maine at my fingertips, but I trust that the numbers are similar enough to illustrate my point. And in Maine, there are 17 reptiles and 18 amphibians and 39 species of fish, 69 mammals, 423 birds, and more than 2,000 species of plants. And that is an impressive list, but also humbling to consider that mosses, lichens, fungi, and liverworts outnumber vascular plants more than 2 to 1, and vertebrates account for less than 2% of all known species. We know very little about the world around us and the creatures with whom we share this landscape with, though I am confident that we humans are indeed just one of many. And this is a chart from a Northeast Wilderness Trust publication showing the amount of species across the Northeast, vertebrates being the smallest number going down to microbes and microorganisms. And this is another chart from another publication showing just how few of the species that we share this planet with we actually know anything about. So it is through this lens, again, community rather than commodity, that I hope that you will consider the questions: why does Vermont need more old forests, and how best can we achieve that? What does the commodity side of Leopold's quote mean? To use the academic term anthropocentrism, it is the worldview, of human-centeredness, the belief that humans are the apex of creation, separate from nature, and that everything else we see here is for our use, enjoyment, and profit. With an anthropocentric worldview, which permeates all aspects of everyday life, it is perfectly rational to see the living earth merely as a reservoir of resources. And we have been at this conservation thing for well over a century now. So why is it that biodiversity continues to collapse at an alarming rate, threatening our very future? Given what we now understand beyond a reasonable doubt, that our health and prosperity are inextricably linked to a thriving biosphere, it is worth considering that this anthropocentric or commodity perspective is the primary driver of the biodiversity crisis. And it drives all of our decision-making, including conservation and land use decision-making. So that has led some recently to argue that speciesism, another word for anthropocentrism, much like racism, imperils humanity and the planet, and neither of them make any sense whatsoever. In a new recently released book on this topic, I'll quote, one of the authors says, "Our cultural and biological manifestations flow from this worldview and snowball to affect how we interact with other forms of life, the physical world, and other people." And this is from Speciesism in Biology and Culture, How Human Exceptionalism is Pushing Planetary Boundaries. Another recent essay published in the journal Conservation Biology argues that conservation continues to fail, as evident by continuous collapse in biodiversity, because conservation and related policymaking is grounded in anthropocentrism. And in her wonderful book, Abundant Earth, Eileen Christ artfully and in deep detail argues that anthropocentrism is at the very root of the biodiversity crisis. So animals need places to live and to raise their young and to find abundant resources to eat. These are fundamental truths. And though through our land management and development and disregard for other forms of life, we continue to alter and in many cases eliminate altogether our wild neighbors' homes, which they require to exist. When we convert a forest to a mall or a housing development, many of the resources that wildlife needs to live simply cease to exist. And when a forest is logged, we are also removing some of those resources, and we affect the species mix and age class in a forest and thus affect natural succession and complexity. Some of what is lost is known and well understood, and much of it is unknown and still not well understood at all. What we do generally understand is that the wildlife with whom we share this landscape with co-evolved with a forest type that is incredibly rare today in Vermont, and that is old forests. And I want to be abundantly clear. I am not here to denigrate forestry. You heard Charlie Hancock last week speak passionately about the acrimony that has seeped into conservation circles and land use policymaking, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. I am a proud champion of wilderness conservation, and I also genuinely support a vibrant forest products economy in our region. I am not, nor is Northeast Wilderness Trust, anti-logging, and it is important to point out it is not an either-or decision. There's no such thing as wilderness good, logging bad. This is a false choice. Well-managed forests provide immense value to society, and so do wilderness areas. They are complementary to each other, not in conflict with one another. However, what Northeast Wilderness Trust is working towards is more balance. in land use broadly and conservation specifically. Our landscape is currently out of balance. So while all land conservation is good, it is also critical to recognize that not all conservation is equal when it comes to protecting biodiversity, very specifically. Today, about 26% of Vermont is conserved in one way or another, and that is on the left side of the screen. I think it's your left also, yes. And you can see everything that's in beige or dark beige is conserved land. And this has led some to proclaim that we only have 4% to go to hit 30 by 30 goals. This is missing the point completely of what 30 by 30 is about. And it's a misunderstanding of a global deal for nature, which laid the foundation for 30 by 30 efforts. While 26% of Vermont is conserved, and that is certainly worth celebrating, only 3%, 3.7% precisely, is legally protected as wildland today, meaning that only 3.7% of Vermont has the legal protections to rewild into an old forest and then stay that way. And that is not to say that only wildlands ought to count towards 30 by 30. When this body is considering what should count for 30 by 30 goals, I urge you to ask yourself, what is the land conserved for and for whom? 30 by 30 is about conserving biodiversity. When it comes to protecting biodiversity, we should be asking ourselves, is a dairy farm with a conservation easement the same as a natural area or a wildlife management area on Vermont state lands? And when it comes to protecting biodiversity, is a sugar bush conserved with a conservation easement and managed for industrial scale maple production the same as a federally protected wilderness area in the Green Mountain National Forest? The international standard for a protected area is a place identified as important for the conservation of nature. This could be a wilderness area, a forever wild conservation easement, an indigenous protected conservation area as are being implemented across Canada, and it could certainly also be managed timberlands or sugar bushes. The key is that these places are conserved first and foremost to sustain natural processes and biodiversity, not to produce commodities. All of the, all of the aforementioned conserved lands, from the dairy farm to the wilderness area, are absolutely critical and worthy of public support, but they are not equal when it comes to conserving biodiversity and supporting natural processes, which in turn supports biodiversity, and that is okay. So why are wild forests important for the protection of biodiversity, and why must they be central to 30 by 30 efforts? Old forests and future old forests are first and foremost, again, protected for biodiversity. And generally speaking, commercial resource extraction is prohibited on such lands, and these places excel at providing habitat for shy and sensitive species. Old unmanaged forests, complex architecture, and ample dead wood support higher densities of forest breeding species, especially interior forest songbirds, snag-dependent creepers, salamanders, arthropods, lichen, and moss. Fungi and underground mycorrhizal networks are more diverse and more abundant in old forests. Lands protected as forever wild are nature's stage, where the processes that create and shape biodiversity play out in real time every day, as they have for millions of years. And they are wildly resilient. They store immense amounts of carbon as well. The most recent comprehensive analysis of using forests across New England as a natural climate solution, which included 5 pathways, including forestry, with wildlands being another, estimated that wildland management stored carbon at twice the rate of actively managed forests. So much of the wildlife of Vermont evolved with old forests. Pre-European settlement Vermont was predominantly old forest, and many characteristics that define that landscape, such as the higher prevalence of old trees, large standing deadwood and snags, downed woody debris on the forest floor, pit and mound topography, that is missing from the landscape today in Vermont. In a landscape where less than 0.5% is primary or old growth forest, and much of Vermont's forests are essentially teenagers between the ages of 70 and 90 years old, when we speak of old forests, we are talking about making decisions today that set the conditions for forests to grow old tomorrow. This is why permanence is critical. Without permanent legal protection, a forest that some may say is on its way to growing old can easily revert to a managed and young forest with a change of administration, commissioner, or executive director. When it comes to old forests, permanence is paramount. Nature is resoundingly resilient if given time and space to recover. In old forests, the complex structure that defines them and the rich biodiversity they harbor will return naturally if we let it. And we know this. And we know that one, and I'll emphasize again, not the only one, but one highly effective strategy for returning old forests to the landscape is forever wild conservation. You do not need to travel far to witness firsthand how forever wild conservation results in the return of old and complex forests. All you have to do is take a ferry across Lake Champlain and visit the Adirondack Park, where 2.9 million acres, which is exactly almost 30% of the entire state of Vermont, is constitutionally protected as forever wild, much of which was former industrial timberlands. This strategy works, and we know it. So I want to end my remarks on a note of cooperation, balance, and optimism. First, I want to reiterate that there is no choice to be made between old forests and managed forests. We need a lot more of both. They are complementary. However, I also urge you to look at the landscape and ask yourself whether just 3.5% of the entire state of Vermont being protected in a manner that ensures future old forests is adequate. I argue that it is not remotely adequate. Even the most conservative goals call for nearly tripling the number of old and wild forests to 9 or 10%. I want you respectfully to think carefully when considering 30 by 30 goals, and again, ask yourself, for whom is this land being conserved and for what purpose? And finally, nature has shown us time and time again that when conserved generously, she does a miraculously good job at sustaining biodiversity and ultimately us as well. There is ample reason to be optimistic about our future, but only if we make the bold and right decisions today. Finally, consider once more Aldo Leopold's question of whether we should look at the land that sustains us, people, and all of our wild relations as a commodity or as a community. Choosing the latter moves us toward a future characterized by integrity, stability, and beauty, another Leopold quote. And that is the right path to be on, I would suggest. And it includes protecting much more forever wild land and thus sowing the seeds of tomorrow's old forests, wildlife refugia in Vermont and across the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Couple questions, Representative
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm curious,
Ben Smith.
how do like wind turbines fall into any like practices that you've dealt with? What's your opinion on them? I guess I mean, as far as how they would go into, would they fit in the forest or not?
I think we have some very challenging land use decisions to make in siting renewable energy in a proper way that allows more of the landscape to grow old. I'm kind of getting out of my lane of expertise.
Yeah, I'm just curious because we deal with that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think that places that are set aside specifically for biodiversity and for the either the persistence of old forests or the laying the foundation for future old forests would probably be a poor site for a wind farm or an industrial wind site. But that's not to say that renewable energy is not important. Right. I kind of look at that as the same choice between old forests and managed forests. We need it's an all of the above strategy, and we need to be thinking about where to place things properly.
Representative Smith.
What a great fence-sitting answer.
Thank you.
Old growth forest. It's important to maintain old growth forest, but to get to what you would like to see in an old growth forest, would that require private property owned by someone that will keep everybody off it? No walking, no carbon footprints,
No,
that type of thing?
no. And I'll give you some real examples from Northeast Wilderness Trust. So I'll talk about the Woodbury Preserve, which we purchased a couple of years ago. It straddles the towns of Woodbury, Elmore, and a couple other towns. It is open to the public for bushwhacking and general access. We have a hunting program that is well loved by many people. So old forests and people have co-evolved together for hundreds of thousands of years. So I would not suggest that to get to old forests or to designate old forests have to come at the sacrifice of eliminating people from the landscape. That's not the case. What the primary distinction is prohibiting resource extraction to give forests the time and space to grow old. People certainly have a place in an old forest or in a preserve. I'll give you one more example. On our Green Mountain National Forest, public land, there's I don't know if it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres of federally designated wilderness areas. Those places are open to hunting, trapping, hiking, backpacking. So I don't see those two things as in conflict whatsoever.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Torrey.
I just remembering from, I don't know if it was earlier this week, the term managing for old growth characteristics.
Yes.
Was shared with us. So that's part of managed forests, but it's trying to kind of straddle.
Yeah, I think there is some wonderful research being done by, there's some great research being done that shows that you can achieve some of the complexity of an old forest through management. And again, I'll kind of take both sides here. I think that is an important strategy on lands that people want to continue managing. But we also know, and again, I'll point to the Adirondack Park, that setting land aside as forever wild, as protected by the Constitution in New York since the late 1800s, is a proven strategy where you don't need to do anything. Nature has been doing this for millions of years. And if you set land aside as forever wild, she does a wonderfully effective job at creating old forests without the need for much management. Both of them are valid strategies. And again, I would not look at it as a either or situation. There's great ways to manage a forest and get some timber products out of it while still fostering some of the qualities that become old.
Representative Bongard.
Hi, just a couple, one, on the 3.7% that you talked, where does that come from? So we've got your 15,000 acres. There's the Aiken Wilderness. What are the components of that 3.7?
Yeah, let me go back if I can. Yeah, so first off, I should say that this map comes from a soon to be released report out of Harvard Forest, Highstead, and Northeast Wilderness Trust, which is the first of its kind study that maps all the wildlands in New England. And where that 3.7% comes from are, I'll give you a couple examples. First of all, are all of the federally designated wilderness areas in Green Mountain National Forest. There's also the Northeast Wilderness Trust lands. It also includes the state natural areas, like the spine of C.C. Putnam State Forest is, I think it's called the Worcester Natural Area. It's like 6,000 or so acres. It also
Protect what's the mechanism for the protection of that?
There is a FPR designation for natural areas. Some of them are quite small, like Moss Glen Falls, for instance, and then some of them are quite large, like the whole top of the alpine zone of Mount Mansfield, or the spine of the Worcester Range again. It also includes nature conservancy lands that are natural areas. It includes, you can see the big blue line here, the Appalachian Trail Corridor and the Long Trail Corridor is a designated wildland. So that's all of those things combined is 3.2%. And again, by comparison, when you consider all conserved lands, which includes working timberlands, sugar bushes, farms, that's about 26% of the state.
So one follow-up with that, Ken, as we're thinking about 30 by 30,
Yep.
And the bill that will be in this committee quickly or soon, we're looking to get to, let's just say, at least the 9% of the Vermont conservation design. Do you have thoughts about how we should try to steer where those additional 6% or more should be? Because you've got, different things going on at different elevations. And so what would your thoughts be about?
Yeah, so a couple places. Vermont Conservation Design does a really great job of identifying the most important habitat blocks and interior large forest blocks. And that's certainly a logical place to start. I would also point to the incredible tool out of the Nature Conservancy, which is their resilient and connected landscape tool. We know with great certainty what lands are going to be the most resilient as the climate changes. And those are great places for these living laboratories of old forests and wilderness areas to exist. At Northeast Wilderness Trust, we highly emphasize, we put a lot of emphasis, I should say, on the resilient data when we're selecting projects to focus our energy on. And I think that's a great place for the state to look at, or for this committee to look at. And then the other thing that I would think about is connectivity. And again, Vermont Conservation Design does a good job of thinking about that. We all have heard of island geography. If you're just protecting pockets of protected areas and not connecting them, that's one of the many reasons that biodiversity continues to decline. Even though we're conserving a lot of land, they're not very well connected. So thinking about connectivity, resilience, and where are the interior forest blocks would be what I would suggest is a great place to start.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. So I have some data questions, just kind of trying to understand the differences here. And Representative Bongart's got to some of my question. What I'm trying to understand is what are the differences between conserved and permanently conserved in a taxing way and in a permitting way? So trying to understand if we are taking, if we treat them the same way.
Okay.
If we use the same processes, it's all new for me.
Sure.
So how do we get there? And then what are the rules once we're there for taxing and permitting?
Okay. I'll try to answer that using Northeast Wilderness Trust as the way to frame that, since that's what I know. In the state of Vermont, and I'll use the Woodbury property as another example. We own that property in fee. So we are the private landowners, although we are a 501c3. And we have enrolled that property in current use under the conservation program of current use, which allows us as a 501c3 to manage it as a wildland and still enroll in current use. So to use us as an example, and I'm fairly confident, although I'm sure someone could prove me wrong. I'm pretty sure most conservation organizations in Vermont, when they own land, pay taxes through current use. So in terms of a tax base, I don't think there is an appreciable difference between, for instance, a managed forest that is enrolled, whether it's conserved or not, whether it's enrolled. So managed forest that's conserved in current use and a wild land that's owned by a nonprofit enrolling it in current use, there shouldn't be much of a difference from a tax base. I admittedly know nothing about how the state covers taxes on public lands or the federal government, so I really I can't comment on that. And then the second part of your question was the difference between conserved and permanently conserved. Is that what you asked?
and I'm not even sure what so is it wildlands? Is that what, I mean,
Yeah.
what is permanently conserved? It's called wildlands? What is it?
So when I use the word or the phrase permanently conserved, it means, I guess, primarily two things. The first is legal protections that run with the deed of a property. So when a land trust owns a property, or let's use a private landowner as an example, when a private landowner conveys a conservation easement to a land trust, that is permanent legal protection. Whether Bob and Sue own the property now and they pass away in 30 years, or they sell it off, or they give it to their kids, that legal protection, that conservation easement remains on the property in perpetuity. That's the basis for our conservation easement framework in this country. It has to be a perpetual conservation easement. And then there's the example, for instance, of the Adirondack Park. So I'll jump over to New York again. Those are forever wildlands, which are protected by the state constitution of New York. And they have been since the late 1800s. That is pretty permanent. You have to go through an amendment process. You need the legislature to weigh in on it. You need a citizen part of that. It needs to go to a vote to amend anything that's constitutionally protected. And then in between, there are a lot of lands that are public lands that are administratively protected. So Forest Parks and Recreation owns a piece of land, and the current management plan says this is managed to be old forest, but that management plan could change in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. So that's a really important question for this committee to be asking. What level of permanence is appropriate for public lands in this state-run lands? And is it sufficient? That's the question I would say needs to be asked here. Is it sufficient to count something as a future old forest, or an old forest now that doesn't have permanent protection? If an administrative change could undermine that designation in 20 years or 50 years, is it permanent or not? And that's a tough question to answer.
So, thank you. And I think I have a good sense of kind of the concepts. What I'm trying to understand are the impacts that we would need to plan for. So if there are taxing consequences, or permitting would be different, not consequences. And I don't recall, Madam Chair, but last year it was, as you've described it in terms of current use, it's as I recall the bill that we passed last year.
Mm-hmm.
My question is more around your comments about we only have 3% that is permanently conserved, and I interpreted that for 30 by 30, you would be looking for us to go to add 27% more, take 27% more off of the grand list, which may be a great idea, but I want to make sure that I understand.
No, it's not.
What you're saying.
I don't, unless I misinterpret the grand list, I'll use Woodbury as an example again. We own it. It's permanently protected as a wildland. It's still listed as private property. It's still on the grand list.
Okay, so current use, but go ahead.
No, so I think
Not interrupt you.
no, I'm not an expert in the tax side of this, but it's my understanding that as a nonprofit, we own land. We're a private landowner, although we're a 501c3. And that land is still on the grand list. We still pay taxes to those towns. It's just at the current use rate rather than the unencumbered or
Okay.
or fair value or whatever that would be called.
So it's a lower tax rate.
I think I know.
Yeah.
It's a lower tax rate, the current use.
So-
And so I'm actually ready to step back from this, but I would just like to say that that will be an important thing for me to understand if there's been any estimating about what reduction in property taxes this would look like at whatever level and being clear about what we mean. So do we mean that we need 27% more permanently conserved, or the 4% conserved? So, and I'm not clear on that. So
I could just add. So again, I think it's important to not look at it in a strictly black and white way. There is a lot of land that can count towards 30 by 30. And again, my way of thinking about it, what I'd ask this body to consider is, what is the purpose of that conserved land? Is it to produce maple syrup, or is it to protect biodiversity? And some places can do both. So the question of what counts is a hard one, but I would ask that the question again to be considered is 30 by 30 is about the protection of biodiversity. So what is the purpose of a conserved place, whether it's state land or private land? Why is it being conserved and why is it being set aside?
So do you think that, would you say that land has to be permanently conserved in order to be for biodiversity? So I don't even know if I'm saying the right word.
No, that's yeah. So
Or is there a lot of gray here?
there's gray area with everything, but I would say if the goal is old forests, and we know that old forests are very effective at promoting rich biodiversity, old forests need permanent protection, in my opinion. I appreciate there's disagreement on that, but it takes 150 years to create the complexity of an old forest. It takes a couple weeks or a month for a logging job to change the trajectory of that forest. So if we're talking about promoting old forests and meeting the 9% in Vermont conservation design, it's my opinion that permanence is absolutely paramount to that.
And I wouldn't interpret my questions or comments as opposition to your goal, but it feels very important to me to just understand what happens when we do that. So what are the consequences of doing that? And then we need to plan for those things and make sure we understand what will happen. So that's all.
Yeah, we're talking about a lot of land and big numbers, and those are really important things to consider. And then we're also talking about the perpetuation of a healthy biosphere, and putting those things into perspective is really it's challenging, and it's really crazy to actually think about the implications of what we're talking about.
And I just want to add that the bill, which we will walk through next week, calls for getting in, like, we don't purport as the legislature to do this work. We're asking the agency to do it, to tell us what has to happen. So it's not a done deal.
Just to add on to this, I think one of the places you're trying to go is understand the tax consequences. And 80%, if I have this right, charging this up from last year, but 80% of privately held forest land, almost effectively, a hell of a lot of it, is in the current use program currently. And what this would likely do is say that some relatively small portion of that would become old growth and still under the same taxation scheme, right? So it would actually have little impact on property taxes.
Yeah.
That's one.
Did we do a fiscal note last year?
We did. That's a great question.
That's the
Yeah,
type of
good.
information.
Yeah,
that I-
we'll get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any further questions for Mr. Leibowitz? Representative,
Just a comment that as we talk about this, I think that in terms of the land that is available for forestry purposes, we need to keep in mind, in my mind, the need for some of that forest products to be used perhaps in increasing amounts for thermal purposes. And I'm not talking about generating electricity, but for large scale thermal purposes that can't be done with electricity. That's a whole other trend that will be in some ways pushing in another direction that needs to be balanced. And in closing, I want to thank you for repeatedly mentioning the majority of towns in my house.
thank you very much for your thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for your patience.
Oh, my pleasure.
Schedule. All right, members, any further comments?
I just have a question.
So
The testimony that we just heard from Mr. Leibowitz,
Avram, we're still in session.
the testimony that we just heard, is that like tied into what Janet, the speaker before, was Janet's,
Jane.
Jane, I'm sorry. Is it tied into that as far as like carbon emissions and
It,
things like that?
it is, and I would like to get into, Jane did a nice high level review for us, but there are very specific policies called for in the climate action plan related to this very topic. So I do hope to get those presented to us.
I just was curious, because I didn't know if there's any other policies coming out regarding the land management or anything.
Yes, there are. I mean, last year we passed a bill to conserve 30% of our lands by 2030. And we're getting ready to walk through that bill.
So it's already here. It's coming in committee. Okay. Will there be other people testifying and
Yes, many.
manage? Okay.
Yes, yeah. That's a great question. Any other questions before we break for the weekend?